All of America was shaken when Rick Harrison, once hailed as the living encyclopedia of reality television, was suddenly sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The moment he was handcuffed and quietly escorted out of the federal courthouse quickly became the most widely shared image of the week. However, what truly stunned the public wasn't just the sentence itself, but Rick's uncharacteristic and intense reaction during the trial, a place where he had always maintained a calm and composed demeanor. This time, he unexpectedly raised his voice, slammed his hand on the table, and fiercely argued with both the judge and the prosecutor in a confrontation like no one had ever seen before. Once known for appearing on television to educate others about historical value and ethical dealings, Rick is now accused of being the mastermind behind an international network involved in antiquities smuggling, money laundering, and tax evasion. The clean image and reputation he had built over more than 15 years are now at serious risk of completely falling apart. The case has prompted both scholars and the general public to ask, is this the dramatic downfall of a pop culture icon? Or is it the result of a deeper conspiracy that no one has fully uncovered yet? And above all, what was really going through Rick Harrison's mind at the moment he heard the verdict? Let's find out in today's video. 1. Before the storm hit. When Pawn Stars officially premiered in 2009, viewers were quickly drawn in, not just by the rare and unusual antiques, but by how Rick turned each item into a vivid piece of living history. The way he held a Roman coin or an old 18th century map and immediately broke down its origin, context, and value made people believe he wasn't just a simple trader. Rick came across as a keeper of heritage, a kind of scholar hidden beneath the surface of a businessman. That image steadily became an almost unshakable symbol in the public eye. In an era where knowledge is often overshadowed by media appeal, Rick stood out as a figure representing practical wisdom. His ego wasn't loud or flashy, but it was always present. I know what I'm doing, and I believe I'm always right. That wasn't just a statement. It was a belief system that had sustained Rick for many years. He believed that knowledge could help him weather any storm. Ironically, that very belief would later become the invisible chain that bound him. Maintaining success in such a niche field like antiquities trading led Rick to gradually develop a sort of emotional immunity. Market turbulence, subtle accusations, even envy from competitors. He had dealt with them all, and most of the time he came out on top, sometimes with sharp logic, other times with cold detachment. Over time, that emotional armor grew thicker, making Rick rarely react on a purely emotional level. He became skilled at hiding everything behind a stern look and a calm voice. In the world of reality TV, where emotions are often amplified, Rick chose to go against the grain. The quieter he was, the more attention he drew. But that excessive emotional control eventually pushed him into a distorted state, an undercurrent of quiet arrogance, paired with an almost blind belief that no one could ever take him down, simply because no one ever had. Then came the first rumor. A vague social media post, unverified, claimed that Rick Harrison was under federal investigation for alleged tax evasion and trading artifacts of unknown origin. Rick's initial reaction? Just a faint smirk of disdain. "This'll blow over," he told a colleague in the business. It wasn't meant to be reassuring. It was Rick reaffirming his deep-rooted belief that he was outside the reach of the system. To him, accusations from the public or the tabloids were just a kind of noise, background static he'd learned to tune out over decades. His view of the situation, as just another summer media storm that would come and go, showed how unaware he was of how serious things had become. This was the first stage in the collapse of belief, denial. From a psychological perspective, that kind of reaction isn't unusual. People who've spent a long time in powerful, celebrated positions often develop a very strong ego defense mechanism. They believe everything that happens around them is just a minor variable in an equation they already know the answer to. They don't see the shift in others' eyes, don't hear the growing coldness in reporters' questions, and don't sense the wave of suspicion spreading quietly, because they've lost the ability to pick up on warning signs in their environment. And Rick was no exception. What's worth noting is that even as the rumors started being confirmed and a few details from the federal investigation began to surface, Rick's demeanor remained unchanged. He didn't hold a press conference to clarify anything, nor did he offer any kind of legal explanation. He simply continued to project an oddly calm presence. Many praised it as a sign of manly composure, but from a psychological perspective, it reflected a form of emotional numbness, a common response in people who are unable to accept the collapse of a worldview they've long held onto. Rick's calmness at that time wasn't a deliberate act of composure. It was more like a natural defense mechanism, one that disconnected him from the looming sense of danger. Ironically, it was Rick's past success that blinded him to his own limitations. He had once been decisive, skilled at filtering information, and precise in every business deal. But now, he was facing a kind of negotiation no book had ever prepared him for, a judgment on his very character and way of life, and he wasn't ready for that at all. Inside Rick at that moment, two conflicting thoughts might have coexisted. On one hand, a firm belief in his innocence, or at least the sense that he was misunderstood. On the other hand, a quiet, unspoken anxiety that was vague at first, but growing clearer over time. That was when emotional resistance began to take shape, even if it hadn't yet shown outwardly. Rick still showed up at the shop like always, still chatted with the staff, still posed for pictures with tourists, but the sharpness in his eyes was gone. In its place was something that resembled doubt, directed at himself. And that was when the first psychological crack appeared. A small, invisible fracture, but one from which everything else would eventually begin to fall apart. 2. The moment of arrest. On a sunny morning in April 2023, as the sun rose high over Las Vegas, a line of unmarked black vehicles suddenly pulled up in front of the gold and silver pawn shop, a place that had been synonymous with Rick Harrison for over 2 decades. There were no sirens, no forced entry, just a few men in black suits wearing badges who silently walked inside. Within minutes, Rick's ordinary life officially came to an end. He was escorted from his home by agents from the FBI, IRS, and representatives from the U.S. Department of Cultural Heritage Protection, not in handcuffs, but without freedom. There were no arguments, no resistance, only a heavy silence that filled the air. Some employees at the shop couldn't hold back their tears. Others tried to capture the moment on their phones, and those very clips quickly went viral on social media within just a few hours. Rick's reaction left many stunned. He didn't lash out, didn't shout like some other public figures who had found themselves in similar situations. On the contrary, he walked as if stepping onto a familiar stage. His face was calm, perhaps even a little proud. But that very composure caught the attention of psychologists. Rick's behavior might have been a sign of extreme emotional detachment, a psychological defense mechanism the brain uses when faced with overwhelming trauma. People in this state often don't show clear emotions, not because they're strong, but because the brain hasn't yet processed the shock and is delaying its response. At that moment, Rick's mind had yet to accept the reality that he, a man who once represented knowledge, integrity in negotiation, and cultural value, was now being treated like a criminal. Throughout the initial questioning and interrogation, Rick didn't resist, nor did he confess or offer any defense. He remained nearly completely silent, responding only with eye contact and a few brief, clear statements. This only reinforced the belief that Rick was still controlling his image, at least outwardly. But the real question is, was that true inner strength, or merely the beginning of an internal collapse? Rick's arrest immediately sparked 2 sharply divided reactions from the public. One side voiced support, demanding "Free Rick," insisting he was the victim of a politically motivated crackdown. The other side, those who had long questioned the transparency of the deals featured on Pawn Stars, now saw this as final proof. Forums on Reddit, Twitter, and YouTube were flooded with hundreds of debate threads. And through all the discussion, Rick stayed silent. That silence, once again, could be interpreted in many ways. A strategic move by a clever man, or a sign of a soul nearing exhaustion. For his family, especially Corey, Rick's eldest son and the one expected to inherit the shop, this shock came completely out of nowhere. In a short interview after the incident, Corey said, "I honestly don't know what's going on. My dad's never done anything wrong. At least I don't think he has." The hesitation in his voice revealed two things: the genuine love of a son and the invisible distance between them. A distance Rick himself had created by keeping everything hidden, even from those closest to him. His family had no idea about the quiet investigation that had been unfolding for months. That shows Rick had chosen to keep everything to himself, or perhaps he simply believed he didn't need to share. For those who had been close to Rick for many years, especially the familiar faces who had built Pawn Stars with him, like Austin Chumley Russell and the historical experts who regularly appeared on the show, this incident left them feeling lost and disoriented. One anonymous friend shared, "Rick is so serious he's almost rigid. If he's the one who's wrong, then I honestly don't know who I can trust anymore." The trust people placed in Rick wasn't just about him as an individual. It represented something larger: faith in knowledge, and in the ideal of the American who makes it through sheer ability. And this fall from grace didn't stop at the legal level. It began to spread like a crack through the collective mindset of society. Not long after being arrested, Rick was released on conditional bail while awaiting trial. He didn't show up on social media, didn't talk to the press, and made no official statements. For the first time in over 15 years, Rick completely disappeared from public life. And that disappearance was the clearest sign that he had entered a period of severe emotional crisis. According to modern psychology, the period following such a shock is known as the functional depression phase. A person going through this may still work, carry out daily routines, and even have conversations, but inside they feel empty, withdrawn, and anxious. It was reported that Rick continued going to the shop for a few hours a day, but he no longer interacted with employees or spoke to customers like he used to. All the filming lights inside the shop were taken down. Posters promoting Pawn Stars were also removed. Gold and silver pawn shop gradually turned into a cold, quiet space, much like the inner world of the man who founded it. The pre-trial period was also when Rick had to face a growing body of evidence presented by investigative authorities. From undeclared antiquities transactions used to avoid taxes, to using intermediaries to buy and sell items suspected of being stolen, the case file kept getting thicker. Though Rick's legal team worked hard to counter each claim, public opinion increasingly leaned toward a guilty verdict. And notably, Rick said nothing in his own defense. However, that silence didn't mean he felt nothing. On the contrary, this might have been the most intense emotional breakdown he had ever experienced. According to the Kubler-Ross model on psychological responses to loss, this was the bargaining and self-blame phase. Quietly, Rick might have been asking himself, did I put too much faith in myself? Or was there a moment in the past when I went off track without realizing it? And the answer was yes, and deep down, he knew it. Another significant turning point during this time came when Rick appeared on several conservative TV programs, where he publicly claimed he was the victim of a political conspiracy, that he was being bullied because of his outspoken views and because he had become too successful in a system that didn't welcome non-traditional success stories. This move was clearly strategic, but it also revealed a major crack in Rick's perception of reality. He was no longer grounded solely in rational thinking. Instead, he began leaning into conspiracy theories as a way to make sense of a truth that was too painful to face. At that point, Rick was no longer the man who used to smile when customers offered too little. no longer the cheerful expert who explained the history behind a Japanese sword. He had become someone else, quieter, more withdrawn, and starting to lose the last remaining connection he had with the public: trust. And that was when the real storm began to form, with a public trial ahead, a sentence looming, and a deep plunge into the very soul of a man who once believed he was invincible. 3. Historic trial. The trial of Rick Harrison officially began on March 12, 2025, at the federal court in Nevada County, marking one of the most high-profile criminal cases in the history of American reality television. International media outlets covered the trial extensively, with more than 60 press agencies authorized to report live from outside the courthouse. Around 200 people were present in the courtroom, including heritage conservation activists, representatives from various international museums, legal experts, and several loyal fans of the Pawn Stars show, selected through a lottery system. The trial lasted a total of 18 days, with 11 witnesses from the prosecution and 4 witnesses from the defense. The prosecution brought 23 charges against Richard Kevin Harrison, including tax evasion, 7 charges, money laundering, 6 charges, illegal dealing of cultural artifacts, 4 charges, conspiracy to destroy evidence, 3 charges, and falsifying accounting records, 3 charges. These charges were based on the results of a nearly 14-month investigation carried out by the FBI, IRS, and the U.S. Department of Cultural Heritage Protection. In the early days of the trial, Rick Harrison showed a cooperative attitude toward his legal team. However, when the prosecutor presented physical and electronic evidence, including internal emails, recorded encrypted exchanges with intermediaries, unreported financial invoices, and a double-entry system documenting over $12 million worth of untaxed artifact transactions, the situation began to shift. The 6th day of the trial became a turning point. Chief Prosecutor William H. Decker presented a series of encrypted messages between Rick Harrison and an international artifact dealer in Spain, in which they agreed to obscure the origin of an 18th-century military document, which had been confirmed as belonging to a prestigious university in the UK. When this evidence was displayed on the large screen in the courtroom, Rick unexpectedly stood up and requested to speak. After a tense exchange with his defense lawyer, David Marshall, who tried to stop him, Rick insisted on speaking out. "I have never received any documents that have been confirmed as stolen property. This is a deliberate conclusion by the prosecution," Rick said loudly, his voice clear but tense. Judge Michael K. Davidson immediately ordered him to sit down and only speak when permitted. Rick immediately responded, "So who will defend my honor? The media outside has already convicted me before the court even did." The trial was adjourned for 45 minutes to allow the lawyers to regain control of the situation. The incident shocked many people in the courtroom, as this was the first time Rick, who was known for his highly controlled demeanor, had reacted so directly and strongly. From that point onward, the atmosphere in the courtroom became increasingly tense. Lawyers from both sides engaged in intense debates over the legality of certain evidence, particularly the documents obtained from Rick's personal phone, which his legal team claimed had been accessed illegally. From day 9 to day 13, the prosecution mainly focused on clarifying the fraudulent activities in the accounting records. Specifically, more than 173 items of antiques, valued between $5,000 and $80,000 USD, were found to be missing from the official financial reports, but were instead recorded in a separate notebook, stored in Rick's personal office. Later, some of these antiques were confirmed to have originated from thefts at local museums in West Virginia, Texas, and Florida. Many other items still have unknown ownership. In defense, the legal team argued that some of the antiques were traded through an independent third party, unrelated to the official procedures of the pawnshop. However, the prosecution continued to present additional internal surveillance footage, showing Rick instructing employees to move special antiques into temporary storage areas without going through the official inventory system. This video was timestamped as being from August 2021. On the 16th, Attorney David Marshall once again requested that the court dismiss the charges of illegal trafficking of cultural heritage, citing insufficient evidence to prove that Rick was aware of the illegal origins of the antiques. However, the judge rejected this request, arguing, "The lack of proper documentation in continuous transactions over many years involving significant amounts is sufficient to establish the existence of organized criminal activity." On the final day of the trial, Rick Harrison was allowed to speak before the panel of judges. He did not plead guilty, but stated that emotions and experience may have overshadowed legal principles. His statement lasted 4 minutes, after which the court began deliberations for the next 48 hours. On the morning of April 2, 2025, the courtroom was packed with people. At exactly 9 a.m., Judge Michael K. Davidson delivered the official sentence: life imprisonment without parole, because the charges were deemed intentional, ongoing, and causing significant harm to national historical property. Immediately following the verdict, Rick Harrison reacted aggressively. He stood up, slammed the table, pointed at the prosecutor, and shouted, "This is not justice!" Security personnel immediately approached, asking Rick to calm down. Attorney David Marshall requested the right to appeal and asked for a delay in the execution of the sentence to review a pardon application. However, the court rejected this request. The scene of Rick being led away in a gray suit, hands cuffed in front of dozens of reporters, became the most shared moment on social media that week. The sentencing video garnered over 9 million views on YouTube within 48 hours. Rick was then transferred to the Victorville Federal Penitentiary in California, a facility for federal prisoners without parole. By regulation, he would not be allowed media access and would not be permitted to write an autobiography during his sentence. In the appeal filed 3 weeks later, Rick's legal team reaffirmed, "The life sentence is an excessively harsh punishment for someone with no prior criminal record and no history of violence." The appellate court has yet to make a decision. The trial has ended, but its legal, cultural, and media impact will continue to reverberate for years to come. 4. After the sentence was delivered. After the life sentence was handed down on March 3, 2025, news about Rick Harrison's case took over nearly all mainstream media outlets in the United States. Within the first 24 hours, the trial became the hottest topic on X, Twitter, YouTube, and Google Trends in the U.S. Over 40 million searches related to the keyword Rick Harrison life sentence were recorded in the first 3 days, surpassing the attention given to other high-profile cases such as Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard in 2022 and Sam Bankman-Fried in 2023. Cable TV networks and online news platforms continuously broadcast images of Rick Harrison being handcuffed and escorted out of the courtroom. The video capturing his reaction in the courtroom, from slamming the table to publicly criticizing the legal system, attracted over 12 million views on YouTube alone in the first week. The media analyzed every gesture, every word, and every moment of silence from Rick as if it were a live broadcast of a drama series. Public reactions were clearly divided into 2 camps. On one side, mainly longtime followers of Pawn Stars, who viewed Rick as a pop culture icon, immediately launched online campaigns calling for a review of the sentence. On the other hand, heritage protection organizations, historians, and international museum communities issued a joint statement supporting the sentence. The American Heritage Protection Association, AHPA, declared, "This is an important legal precedent to warn against the illegal trade of cultural heritage, regardless of who the offender is or how famous they may be." Additionally, several universities and academic institutions officially severed their media ties with Pawn Stars, removing Rick's name from their cultural sponsorship lists. On the family side, Corey Harrison, Rick's son, was the only one to speak out after the trial. In a brief press conference in Las Vegas, he stated, "I do not deny that what my father did was wrong, but I believe that, given his contributions to the cultural sector, he deserves a chance to make amends." This statement was widely shared and received sympathy from many neutral fans. Some fan groups even organized prayer vigils and candlelight ceremonies outside the gold and silver pawn shop, which remained open under Corey's temporary management. International media also began to take an interest in the case, especially in Europe, where many organizations involved in artifact restoration and preservation are based. Newspapers like Le Monde, France, and Der Spiegel, Germany, dedicated special sections to the case, viewing it as a wake-up call about the blurred line between culture and commerce in the reality TV era. In Japan and South Korea, two countries where artifacts appeared on Pawn Stars, local governments also began reviewing related transactions. Meanwhile, Rick Harrison was officially transferred to the Federal Correctional Facility in Victorville, California, a medium-security federal prison specializing in holding nonviolent offenders with long sentences. According to reports from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, Rick is classified as a Level 3 inmate, meaning he is considered non-dangerous, with a high level of self-discipline, and is allowed limited community interaction through correspondence. Information from his lawyer reveals that Rick does not oppose the conditions of his detention, but he has declined all interview requests from the press. During the first 3 weeks, he neither sent letters nor made phone calls, and he refrained from communicating anything to the outside world. According to prison staff, Rick spends most of his time in the prison library, primarily reading books on ancient history and federal criminal law. However, a small shift occurred in the 4th week. Rick began responding to handwritten letters from fans. Initially, these were just short postcards from school children sending their well wishes, but soon after, he received longer letters from middle-aged viewers who shared how they had learned about history through his show. Some of the letters were said to have deeply moved him. According to an anonymous mailroom staff member, Rick carefully read every word, underlined certain phrases, and even kept a few letters without sending them back. Another significant development was his request for permission to write a personal memoir. His proposal, submitted to the prison management, was tentatively titled Pawned: The Story I Never Told. Although federal law requires any commercial publication from prison to undergo several rounds of review, this action marks the first sign that Rick is attempting to reclaim his voice, not to defy the law, but to rebuild his public image. During this same period, History Channel officially announced the cancellation of all contracts related to Rick Harrison and Pawn Stars. All episodes featuring Rick were removed from the broadcast system, and streaming platforms also hid the content. This move was unprecedented in the reality television industry in the US, and was seen as an effort to erase the brand to protect advertising partners and sponsors. Nevertheless, Rick Harrison's influence, whether positive or negative, continued to spread. Media experts have noted that the anti-hero cultural figure that Rick represents could become a new concept in the strategy of repositioning a personal brand after a scandal. The question now is, can Rick Harrison transition from a convicted figure to a symbol of cultural awakening in the future? 5. The price of hypocrisy. Immediately after Rick Harrison was officially convicted, many scholars and experts in the fields of preservation and history education began to speak out about a long-debated issue: the boundary between spreading historical knowledge and exploiting it for personal gain. Rick Harrison's case, once regarded as a television symbol bringing historical value to the public, has now become a prime example of the collapse of ethical systems, where personal interests dominate and overshadow the core principles of culture and education. For over a decade, the show Pawn Stars was included by more than 60 universities and colleges in the US and Canada as a reference material for courses on applied history, commercial economics, and mass communications. Rick Harrison, with his extensive knowledge, was invited to speak at specialized seminars hosted by the American Historical Association, AHA, and the Smithsonian Institution, and even received the Cultural Citizen Award from the National Museum of American History in 2016. Thus, his downfall is not merely a criminal case, but a harsh reflection of a contemporary media phenomenon. the commercialization of the educational image, and the pricing of cultural values as if they were merchandise in the intellectual black market. One prominent analysis comes from Professor Marcus Halberstam of Columbia University, who stated, "Rick Harrison understands history to the point where he can exploit it. And that understanding, when unchecked by ethical control, has become a dangerous tool. The use of personal networks to buy and sell artifacts with unclear provenance, particularly actions like removing labels, altering verification diagrams, and obscuring transaction records, shows that Rick was not only inadvertently involved, but also strategically engaged in accessing the gray collectibles market, where historical value is secondary to market value." An internal report from the International Heritage Commission, IHC, revealed that, between 2017 and 2022, at least 47 artifacts purchased by Rick through intermediaries in Europe and Asia showed signs of being linked to artifact trafficking. 3 of these items were confirmed to be stolen from museums in Ukraine, Italy, and Cambodia. Legal experts in the academic field have begun to question the collective responsibility for controlling the cultural media commerce activities. Some argue that the reality television industry has long condoned ethical hypocrisy by turning shows like Pawn Stars into purely entertainment products, without any checks on the authenticity of the transactions broadcast. Many scholars, including Dr. Carla Jensen of UCLA, have called for the establishment of a new legal framework for television programs that blend cultural and commercial elements. Notably, during a special symposium held by the International Council of Museums, ICOM, in Geneva, shortly after the verdict was announced, representatives from 17 countries proposed a comprehensive re-examination of all artifacts featured on Pawn Stars throughout its 15-year broadcast history. In response, a specialized international body was established, comprising organizations such as UNESCO and Interpol's Cultural Unit, tasked with cataloging and tracing the provenance of artifacts previously handled by Rick Harrison and his network. Beyond the legal ramifications, the case has sparked significant ethical discussions within academic institutions focusing on business, media, and cultural studies. Numerous personal branding curricula now use Rick Harrison as a counterexample to successful case studies like Elon Musk, Oprah Winfrey, or Bob Iger. At the Wharton School of Business, University of Pennsylvania, a model called the Harrison Effect has been developed to analyze the consequences of compromising foundational principles for the sake of optimizing image and short-term profits. In the field of conservation, the incident has led to a wave of calls for stricter regulations on the verification and declaration of cultural artifacts. In the United States, both public and private museums have upgraded their systems for provenance checks on incoming items. A federal bill titled the Cultural Transactions Integrity Act has been introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives, mandating that all cultural property transactions exceeding $500 must undergo federal verification, a system akin to international financial transaction controls. Public perception of Rick Harrison has also shifted dramatically. A survey conducted by USA Today involving over 15,000 participants revealed that 64% considered the sentence appropriate and necessary as a deterrent. 21% felt it was too severe but not unjust. Only 8% fully opposed the verdict, and 7% had no opinion. This indicates that while online communities may be divided, societal attitudes have clearly changed in response to the legal evidence and practical implications of the case. It is noteworthy that Rick has never denied his knowledge or experience. He did not claim ignorance or deceit. Instead, his legal team's consistent argument has been that Rick acted based on personal experience, within an environment with legal loopholes and without intent to cause harm. However, this raises a significant question. Can knowledge, when devoid of responsibility, become a greater wrongdoing than ignorance itself? This is precisely what makes Rick Harrison's conviction a cultural milestone, not for its criminal nature, but because it exposes the darker side of unrestrained intelligence. Statements like, "I did this to protect heritage by placing it in the hands of those who value it," made by Rick in a 2021 interview, have now become seen as disingenuous in the eyes of the public. The cost of this rationalization is not just a life sentence, but the loss of status, credibility, and cultural influence that he had built over decades. The future of a prisoner. Although the sentence against Rick Harrison has been handed down from a legal standpoint, the events following the trial show that this story is far from over, at least not in the eyes of the public, the media, and the cultural industry. In a society that increasingly relies on image, branding, and digital media, punishment is no longer simply about serving time, but also about how society remembers or reshapes a person. And in this regard, Rick Harrison remains an unresolved case. In the first week after Rick's conviction, a number of independent media channels and political cultural podcasts began to explore the case as a new symbol of victims of the system. On the Freedom Voices network, freelance journalist Mike Renner asked the question, "Is Rick Harrison the embodiment of a pragmatic businessman destroyed by a legal system that is outdated and unable to keep up with the digital commerce world?" His video quickly garnered over 4.5 million views within just 5 days of being released. At the same time, Kayla Duran's Culture Reset podcast analyzed Rick's case as a tragic story of the collapse of pop culture as the boundary between entertainment and education has become blurred. A clear trend is starting to emerge. From being seen as a convicted criminal, Rick Harrison is increasingly being viewed by some members of the public as a typical anti-hero of the age. No longer an idealized figure, but also not entirely discarded, he has become a symbol of the contradictions between the law, ethics, and social realities. On forums like Reddit and X, Twitter, the term Rick effect began to be used to describe cases where public figures are demystified, but still manage to maintain a loyal fan base. At the same time, an independent documentary filmmaking group in New York announced a project titled Pawned: The Fall of a Cultural Broker, scheduled for release in early 2026. This film will not only focus on the case itself, but will also analyze Rick's impact on the global antiques trade, how reality television has turned ordinary people into icons, and the dark side of privatizing historical memory through the media. The project raised over $1.2 million from backers on Kickstarter in just 3 weeks. Simultaneously, Rick's legal team continues to pursue legal actions to request a reconsideration of the sentence. The appeal filed with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, expected to be reviewed in the second quarter of 2026, argues that the life sentence is disproportionate to the non-violent nature of the offense and overlooks the long-term cultural contributions of the defendant. The legal team has also proposed an alternative rehabilitation model, allowing Rick to serve in a cultural capacity at educational institutions or national museums, with strict supervision. While the likelihood of this being approved remains uncertain, it is seen as a viable option if society shifts toward a restorative form of punishment. Another factor gradually shaping Rick's image for the future is the perception of younger audiences. On platforms like TikTok and YouTube Shorts, short clips from old Pawn Stars episodes featuring Rick continue to attract millions of views. Comments under these videos often include phrases like, "He got too real," "They silenced the truth," or "He knew too much," reflecting how some viewers, especially among Gen Z and millennials, see Rick as a victim of the power structure rather than a mere criminal. This suggests that the process of redefining his image is quietly ongoing in the public's cultural commentary. Unofficial media, especially on podcast platforms, personal vlogs, and open forums, are creating a third space, one where Rick is neither a criminal nor a hero, but a mirror reflecting society. According to sociologist Linda McCraw from the Harvard Kennedy School, this is a time when the public no longer seeks perfect characters, but those who have fallen yet still carry a message. In this context, Rick, despite being convicted, may be reborn in culture as a symbol of caution. Even within the television industry, there have been internal discussions about the possibility of reviving or transforming the Pawn Stars brand. According to an anonymous source from A+E Networks, the parent company of the History Channel, there has been a proposal to develop a new television series in a docu-series format reflecting the legal, ethical, and social consequences of those who were once public figures, with Rick Harrison as the first case study. This project is still in the early research phase and has not been officially confirmed. The possibility of Rick Harrison returning to the public eye is there, but not in the same way. There will no longer be episodes featuring antique items with his half-smile and the phrase, "the best I can do is." Instead, it could be a show addressing the darker side of the cultural trade industry, or a series of lectures on mistakes and responsibility in the post-fame world. Whatever form it takes, the public will decide whether Rick truly becomes a living lesson or will forever remain a name locked in legal memory. This video concludes here. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on more behind-the-scenes stories of famous cultural cases. See you in the next video.